The air in the Missouri Ozarks during the summer of 1871 was a thick, suffocating thing. It was a blanket of heat and humidity, woven with the drone of cicadas and the scent of pine and damp earth. For a 10-year-old boy named Samuel Page, chasing a runaway fox through the dense woods, it was the only world he had ever known. But on that sweltering August afternoon, the familiar woods would betray him, leading him to a place that was not marked on any map, a place that defied reason and God. He found himself in a small, unnaturally quiet clearing he'd never seen before, deep within the territory locals knew to avoid. This was the edge of Whisper Creek Hollow, the domain of the Hollow clan. And in the center of that clearing sat an old stone well, its mouth gaping open to the sky like a silent scream. The stench hit him first, a foul, coppery sweet odor of decay that clung to the back of his throat. It was worse than any dead animal he'd ever come across. It was ancient and profound. Curiosity, that fatal engine of youth, pulled him closer. He peered over the moss-slicked stones down into the oppressive darkness. The water level was low, the surface a black, stagnant mirror, but something pale broke the surface. At first, he thought it was a tangle of bleached roots or discarded animal carcasses. But as his eyes adjusted to the gloom, the shapes began to resolve themselves into a horrifying tableau. A human jawbone, its teeth still intact, rested against a fractured rib cage. A slender femur, clearly that of a child, was tangled with the vertebrae of a much larger adult. It was not one skeleton, but a grotesque latticework of dozens, perhaps more. This was not a grave. It was a repository, a cold, silent archive of death that had been collecting secrets for generations. The boy stumbled back, a choked gasp escaping his lips, the forest sounds rushing back in a deafening wave. He had found the Hollow clan's forbidden secret. He had found the Well of Bones. Samuel Page did not stop running until the sun-bleached porch of his family's homestead came into view. The words tumbled out of him in a frantic, incoherent torrent of the smell, the stones, the pale glint of bone in the dark water. His father, a stern man hardened by the Civil War and the unforgiving land, listened with a grim face. At first he dismissed it as a child's overactive imagination, a nightmare brought on by the oppressive heat. But the sheer, unfeigned terror in his son's eyes was undeniable. It was a primal fear, the kind that sinks its hooks deep into the soul and never lets go. That evening, word was sent to the nearest town of Prosperity and to the county's lone lawman, Sheriff Josiah Kane. The location Samuel described was chillingly specific. He had strayed into the lands bordered by the Hollow family's property, a reclusive and deeply distrusted clan who had inhabited Whisper Creek Hollow for as long as anyone could remember. They were a people apart, their lineage shrouded in whispers and dark folklore. They didn't trade in town, they didn't attend church, and they didn't welcome visitors. Their land was considered banned territory by superstitious locals, a place where people and livestock had a tendency to vanish. The Hollows were seen as a remnant of a wilder, older time, clinging to traditions that civilized folk had long since abandoned. Sheriff Kane, a practical man who had seen his share of violence in the war, was skeptical. He'd heard the campfire tales about the Hollow clan, stories of strange rituals conducted under the full moon, of a curse on their land, of an almost supernatural ability to endure where others failed. He dismissed them as the fearful ramblings of isolated people. But a well filled with human bones was not folklore. It was evidence of a crime so monstrous, so prolonged, it was almost inconceivable. The next morning, as a heavy mist clung to the valleys, Sheriff Kane saddled his horse and rode out towards Whisper Creek Hollow, unaware that he was riding toward a secret far older and more disturbing than he could ever imagine. Whisper Creek Hollow was less a geographic location and more a pocket of primal wilderness that had resisted the relentless march of progress. To reach it, Sheriff Kane had to leave the well-worn dirt roads behind, following a barely there trail that snaked through oppressive thickets of oak and hickory. The air grew cooler here, the sunlight struggling to pierce the dense canopy above. The silence was profound, broken only by the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. This was a place that felt forgotten by time. The Hollow clan had settled here sometime in the late 1700s, led by a patriarch named Jedediah Hollow. They were Scotch-Irish immigrants, a clannish and fiercely independent people who sought isolation above all else. They carved out a life in the Hollow, building their homestead from the timber and stone of the valley itself, utterly self-sufficient and hostile to any and all outsiders. Over the generations, they had become a local legend. Their infrequent trips to town for salt or iron were tense affairs. The Hollows were tall and gaunt, with pale eyes that seemed to look right through you. They spoke in a dialect thick with archaic phrases, and they carried with them an aura of profound otherness. Locals whispered that they were a cursed family, that the land itself had tainted them. Stories abounded of travelers who had sought shelter in the Hollow during a storm and were never seen again. A land surveyor sent to chart the county lines in the 1840s reportedly entered Whisper Creek Hollow and vanished without a trace, his horse found wandering miles away, its saddlebags empty. These were dismissed as ghost stories, cautionary tales to keep children from wandering too far. But as Sheriff Kane rode deeper into their domain, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was crossing a forbidden threshold, entering a place where the normal laws of man and nature no longer applied. He was not just investigating a crime, he was confronting a legacy. The Hollow homestead was a grim, defensive cluster of buildings that looked as if they had grown out of the earth itself. The main house was a two-story log structure, its timbers darkened by a century of rain and sun, with a massive stone chimney at its core. Small, shuttered windows stared out like suspicious eyes. Several smaller cabins and barns were scattered nearby, all enclosed by a formidable split-rail fence that seemed designed less to keep livestock in and more to keep the outside world out. As Sheriff Kane approached, a pack of skeletal-looking hounds erupted in a cacophony of vicious barks, their chains straining. A figure emerged from the main house, a man well past 60 but with a straight-backed posture and an air of absolute authority. This was Silas Hollow, the clan's current patriarch. He held a long rifle casually in the crook of his arm, his thumb resting near the hammer. His face was a mask of deep-set wrinkles, and his eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, were cold and devoid of any welcome. He did not speak, merely watched as the sheriff dismounted. Kane explained his purpose, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence of the Hollow. He spoke of the page boy's discovery of the Well of the Bones. Throughout the explanation, Silas Hollow's expression did not flicker. He listened with a chilling stillness, his gaze unwavering. When the sheriff finished, the old man finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He claimed the well was an old Indian burial site, a sacred place they had been taught never to disturb. It was a plausible lie, a convenient explanation for the presence of old bones in this wild country. But it was the way he said it, with a complete lack of surprise or concern, that set Kane's teeth on edge. There was no shock, no horror, only a flat, dismissive denial. It was the cold, practiced response of a man who had been preparing to answer this exact question for his entire life. Sheriff Kane was not a man easily intimidated, but the collective gaze of the Hollow clan was something he had never before experienced. As he spoke with Silas, other family members emerged from the cabins and the shadows of the porch. They moved with a strange, silent coordination, surrounding him in a loose, informal circle. There were gaunt-faced sons with their father's same cold eyes, and women in drab, homespun dresses, their expressions veiled and unreadable. They did not speak or threaten, they simply watched. Their silence was more unnerving than any open hostility. Kane insisted on being shown the well. After a long, tense moment, Silas gave a curt nod and led the way, the rest of the clan trailing behind like a silent, watchful procession. They moved through the woods with a practiced familiarity, their feet making almost no sound on the forest floor. The clearing was just as Samuel Page had described it, quiet, shadowed, with the ancient stone well at its heart. The foul stench of decay was thick in the air, a testament to the macabre secret it held. The sheriff knelt at the edge, peering into the darkness. The sight was even more horrifying than the boy's description. It was a tomb, a vertical, watery catacomb filled with the commingled remains of countless individuals. Using a long branch, he carefully prodded the contents, bringing a skull to the surface. It was caked in mud and algae, but even to his untrained eye it was clearly not ancient. Strands of dark hair still clung to the bone. This was no Indian burial ground. This was a dumping site for the recently deceased. He looked up at Sela's hollow, whose face remained a stony mask. "This is no burial," Kane said, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and dread. "These people were put here." Silas simply stared back at him, his pale eyes reflecting the dappled sunlight. "The land takes what it needs," the patriarch said, his voice a low whisper that was almost lost in the oppressive silence. "It always has." The statement was so bizarre, so utterly devoid of normal human logic, that for a moment the sheriff was speechless. He was dealing with something far beyond simple murder. He was facing a worldview, a belief system so alien and so deeply ingrained that it saw this horrifying well not as a crime scene, but as a necessity. The phrase, "the land takes what it needs," echoed in Sheriff Kane's mind as he rode back to prosperity. It was not a confession, nor was it a denial. It was a declaration of faith, a statement of Macabre philosophy. Back in his small, dusty office, he began to dig through the county's sparse records, searching for any documented disappearances in the vicinity of Whisper Creek Hollow. The task was daunting. In a land as wild and untamed as post-war Missouri, people vanished all the time. Travelers fell victim to bandits, settlers succumbed to disease or starvation, and lone prospectors simply disappeared into the vast wilderness. Most were never reported, their absence noted only by the passage of time. Yet a disturbing pattern began to emerge. In 1848, a German immigrant family, the Schneiders, purchased a plot of land bordering the Hollow's territory. They were reportedly building a homestead when they simply stopped. Neighbors who went to check on them found their cabin half-built, tools rusting where they had been dropped, and a pot of stew filled with mold over a cold fire pit. The family of 5 was gone. No tracks, no signs of a struggle. They had vanished from the face of the earth. Then there was the case of Reverend Elijah Tate in 1855, a zealous traveling preacher who made it his personal mission to bring the word of God to the heathens of the remote hollows. He was last seen riding his mule towards Whisper Creek, his Bible held high. Neither he nor his mule were ever seen again. The most recent case was from 1869, just 2 years prior. A pair of fur trappers, seasoned men who knew the Ozarks like the back of their hands, were reported missing after setting a line of traps along the creek that flowed out of the Hollow's valley. All these incidents had been filed away as unfortunate but ultimately unsolvable cold cases, tragic footnotes in the harsh story of frontier life. Now, viewed through the horrifying lens of the Well of Bones, they were no longer isolated tragedies. They were chapters in a single, terrifying story. A story that had been written in blood and bone, hidden in the dark, silent water of the Hollow clan's well. Sheriff Kane knew he could not act alone. The Hollow clan was a formidable, self-contained unit, and their land was a natural fortress. Any attempt to arrest them would be met with unified, violent resistance. He needed evidence, something concrete that would allow him to bring in a posse, perhaps even state marshals. He needed to understand the true nature of the well. His first and most crucial task was to retrieve some of the remains for proper examination. He enlisted the help of Doc Abernathy, the town's physician and a man with a morbidly scientific curiosity. Under the cover of a moonless night, a small, trusted party of 3, Kane, Abernathy, and a strong-backed deputy named Miller, made their way back to Whisper Creek Hollow. The journey was fraught with tension. Every snapped twig, every hoot of an owl sounded like a warning. The hollow was even more menacing in the dark, a place of deep shadows and unseen watchers. At the well, they worked quickly and quietly, using ropes and grappling hooks to carefully retrieve what they could from the gruesome repository. The stench was overpowering, and the task itself was a descent into a nightmare. They brought up skulls, long bones, even a partially articulated torso, its tattered clothing still clinging to the skeletal frame. They wrapped the remains in canvas sacks and loaded them onto a pack mule, their hearts pounding with the fear of discovery. Back in Doc Abernathy's surgery, the true horror of the well began to reveal itself under the grim light of an oil lamp. Abernathy, a man accustomed to the grim realities of 19th-century medicine, was visibly shaken. The bones told a story of methodical brutality. There were men, women, and children. Some skulls showed clear evidence of blunt force trauma, others had the small, neat hole of a bullet. But there was something else, something far more disturbing. On several of the vertebrae and ribs, Abernathy found a series of strange, parallel scratch marks etched deep into the bone. They were not tool marks from a butcher, nor were they the gnawing of animals. They were deliberate, precise, and repeated on victims separated by what looked like decades. It was a signature, a ritual. This was not just murder. It was a horrifying, generational practice. The discovery of the ritualistic markings shifted the investigation from a criminal inquiry into something that felt closer to an anthropological study of a lost, savage tribe. What kind of belief system would demand such a thing? Sheriff Kane was a man of law and order, of tangible facts and evidence. But here, in the face of these marked bones, he was forced to confront the realm of superstition and folklore he had so readily dismissed. He began speaking to the oldest residents of the surrounding area, not as a lawman, but as a curious historian, carefully prying loose the stories they had held onto for a lifetime. He spoke with an old trapper who claimed his grandfather had traded with Jedediah Hollow back in the early days. The grandfather had described the Hollows as people who held to the old ways, a term he used with a mixture of fear and reverence. He spoke of their belief in the spirit of the land, a demanding entity that had to be appeased. They didn't worship God. They made pacts with the soil and the trees and the creek. An elderly woman whose family had lived in the region for a century recounted a chilling piece of lore. She said the Hollows believed that for their clan to thrive in that isolated valley, for their crops to grow and their children to be born healthy, the land required a periodic tithe, a blood price. Outsiders, those who did not belong to the Hollow, were seen as vessels for this payment. They were not people, they were offerings. The stories were fantastical, the stuff of Gothic novels. But they aligned with a terrifying precision to the evidence Kane was uncovering. The vanished travelers, the German family, the preacher, they weren't just victims of random violence. They were sacrifices. Sela's Hollow's cryptic words to the sheriff, "The land takes what it needs," were not an evasion. They were the absolute, horrifying truth of their existence. The well was not a landfill for their victims. It was their altar, a sacred, macabre place where they fed the entity that they believed sustained them. The psychological weight of the Hollow clan's secret began to press down on Sheriff Kane. He was sleeping less, the images from the well replaying in his mind. The town of Prosperity, once a place of simple, frontier concerns, now felt like it was sitting on the edge of a great, unholy darkness. The sheriff found himself looking at his neighbors, at the faces of his community, and wondering how such a profound evil could exist so close by, hidden in plain sight for generations. He was a man adrift in a sea of encroaching dread. The evidence he possessed was damning, yet circumstantial. He had bones, but he couldn't definitively tie a single bone to a single member of the Hollow clan. He had folklore and rumor, but no court in the land would convict a man based on ghost stories. He needed an eyewitness. He needed someone from inside the clan to break the generations of silence. But the idea of penetrating the Hollow's wall of insular loyalty seemed impossible. They were a closed loop, a family bound not just by blood, but by a shared, monstrous secret that had been their organizing principle for a century. Any betrayal would be a betrayal of their entire history, their entire faith. His investigation had reached a dead end. He could watch the Hollows, he could document their movements, but he couldn't touch them. The well was sealed now. After his visit, the clan had covered it with a massive slab of rock, effectively burying their secrets once more. To the outside world, Whisper Creek Hollow was quiet again, but Kane knew it was the predatory stillness of a serpent, coiled and waiting. The land would grow hungry again. It was only a matter of time. And as the weeks turned into months, A gnawing fear grew in the sheriff's heart, that he wasn't just investigating a series of past crimes, but that he was in a race against time to prevent the next horrifying sacrifice from taking place. Winter settled over the Ozarks, draping the hills in a shroud of snow and ice. The isolation of Whisper Creek Hollow became absolute. For Sheriff Kane, it was a season of frustration and dark contemplation. The case had gone cold, buried under the snow just as the well itself was buried under its new stone cap. The people of Prosperity, while initially horrified by the rumors, began to settle back into their routines. The macabre tale of the Well of Bones started to transform, softening at the edges, becoming just another piece of local folklore, a grim story to be told by the fire on a long winter's night. But for Kane, it remained a raw, open wound. He had seen the bones. He had touched the marked vertebrae. He knew the truth, and the burden of that knowledge was a heavy one. It was during this period of forced inaction that a strange opportunity presented itself. A young woman from the Hollow clan, Ilara Hollow, began making infrequent but regular trips into Prosperity. This was unheard of. For decades, the clan had kept to themselves, sending out only their men for the barest of necessities. Ilara was different. She was in her late teens, with the same pale eyes as the rest of her kin, but there was a flicker of something else in them. Not fear, but a deep, simmering resentment. She would trade a few carefully crafted wooden figures for flour and thread, her interactions with the townsfolk clipped and wary. Kane observed her from a distance at first, patient and calculating. He learned that she was Silas Hollow's youngest daughter, and rumor had it she was being forced into a marriage with one of her own cousins to keep the bloodline pure. This, perhaps, was the crack in the wall he had been searching for. The whispers and rumors of the outside world, the forbidden histories the Hollow clan tried so desperately to keep at bay, are the very things we seek to unearth on this channel. If you feel compelled to follow this descent into one of America's darkest cold cases, subscribe now. Because Ilara Hollow was the key, and the story she would eventually tell was more horrifying than anyone could have possibly imagined. Sheriff Kane decided to approach Ilara Hollow not as a lawman, but as a potential ally. He chose his moment carefully, intercepting her on the path just outside of town as she was beginning her long walk back to the Hollow. He did not mention the well or the bones or his investigation. Instead, he spoke to her of the outside world. He asked about her carvings, commenting on their intricate detail. He spoke of St. Louis, of the railways, of a world beyond the suffocating confines of her valley. At first she was silent and suspicious, her hand never straying far from the small knife she kept at her belt. But Kane was patient. He could see the hunger in her eyes, the desperate curiosity about a life she had been denied. He began to plant seeds of doubt. He spoke of freedom, of choice, of the right to love and marry whomever one pleased. He contrasted the vibrant, changing world with the stagnant, unchanging traditions of her family. He was playing a dangerous game, attempting to sever a bond forged over a century of isolation and indoctrination. He met with her several times over the next few weeks, always in secret, always on the road away from prying eyes. He became a source of forbidden knowledge, a window into another reality. He learned that the rumors were true. Her father, Silas, had promised her to her cousin, a brutish man named Caleb. It was her duty, Silas had told her, to the clan and to the land. Her purpose was to bear children who would carry on their sacred traditions. But Ilara did not want to be a vessel for tradition. She dreamed of seeing a city, of wearing a store-bought dress, of a life where her path was not predetermined by a dark, bloody pact made by her ancestors. The resentment Kane had first seen in her eyes was beginning to blossom into the first, fragile shoots of rebellion. She was on the precipice, terrified of her family's wrath, but equally terrified of the future they had planned for her. The turning point came on a bitter, windswept day in early March. Ilara met Sheriff Kane at the usual spot, but this time her face was bruised and her arm was in a makeshift sling. Her cousin Caleb, impatient and cruel, had tried to force himself on her, and when she fought back, he had beaten her. Her father, Silas, had done nothing to stop it. He had simply watched, his cold eyes conveying a silent approval. The sanctity of the bloodline, the continuation of their pact, was more important than his daughter's well-being. The violence had shattered any remaining loyalty Alara felt toward her kin. In a flood of whispered, terrified words, she began to talk. She confirmed the legends, the folklore, the sheriff's darkest suspicions. She spoke of the tithe of the hollow, a ritual that had been practiced by her family since the time of Jedediah. She explained that they believed the spirit of the land granted them prosperity and protection within their isolated valley, required a life, or lives, to sustain it. The victims were always outsiders, people who trespassed on their land or who were lured there under false pretenses. They were seen as having no soul, no connection to the hollow, and therefore their lives were forfeit. The well was their most sacred site, a place she called the Well of Echoes, because they believed the spirits of the sacrificed remained there, feeding the earth with their essence. Her words painted a picture of a family not as simple murderers, but as devout acolytes of a horrifying, blood-soaked religion of their own making. It was a cult of isolation, a faith built around a well of bones, and she had been born into the heart of it. Alara's confession was a torrent of generational horror. She described the rituals in chilling, matter-of-fact detail, the way a person might describe the mundane process of planting crops or mending a fence. The selection of a victim was a deliberate process. Sometimes it was an unfortunate traveler who strayed too close. Other times, the men of the clan would go out, hunting for a suitable offering. A lone rider, a prospector, someone who would not be easily missed. The German family, the Schneiders, had been a great boon. Their attempt to settle on land the hollows considered sacred was a grave insult to the spirit of the land, and their entire family was taken over the course of one terrifying night to appease its anger. She explained the strange marks on the bones. Before a victim was dispatched, the matriarch of the clan, currently her own mother, Elspeth, would perform a ritual carving. Using a sharpened piece of obsidian that had supposedly been passed down from Jedediah's wife, she would carve the clan's symbol into the flesh and bone of the offering. The symbol represented the creek, the trees, and the well, the three pillars of their faith. It was a mark of ownership, branding the soul as a permanent part of the hollow. The act was performed while the victim was still alive, their pain and terror considered a vital part of the energy being fed to the land. As she spoke, Alara's voice was devoid of emotion, her eyes distant, as if she were reciting a lesson learned by rote since childhood. This was the normality she had grown up in. The periodic disappearances, the secret late-night processions to the well, these were the cornerstones of her existence. Sheriff Kane listened, his blood running cold. This was a truth more macabre and more deeply rooted than he could have ever fathomed. The Hollow clan was not just a family of killers. They were the priests and priestesses of a dark god of their own creation. With Alara's testimony, Sheriff Kane finally had what he needed. He had a witness who could not only corroborate the physical evidence, but could explain the incomprehensible motive behind a century of murder. He spent the next few days in secret meetings, planning his move. He knew he could not simply ride into the Hollow and arrest the entire clan. They would fight to the death to protect their way of life and their monstrous beliefs. He needed overwhelming force. He sent a rider to the state capitol, requesting the assistance of U.S. Marshals, citing a massive criminal conspiracy and a cult-like organization responsible for dozens of murders over several decades. While he waited for a response, he formulated a plan with Alara. She was to return to the Hollow and act as if nothing had happened. It was a terrible risk, but her presence was necessary. She was his only link to the inside. Her fear was palpable. She knew that if her betrayal was discovered, her fate would be swift and terrible. She would become the next offering to the well, her own family carrying out the ritual. Kane promised her protection, a new life far away from the Ozarks, a future free from the shadow of the well. It was this promise, this fragile hope of a different world, that gave her the courage to return to the heart of the darkness she had just exposed. As she walked back up the trail towards Whisper Creek Hollow, she was no longer just a daughter of the clan. She was a spy, a saboteur, a ghost walking among her own family, waiting for the moment of reckoning. The days that followed were a torment of suspense for both the sheriff and the young woman, each moment fraught with the possibility of discovery and violent retribution. The quiet hollow was a tinderbox, and Alara's confession had just lit the fuse. The U.S. Marshals arrived a week later, a dozen grim-faced men led by a senior marshal named Elias Thorne. Thorne was a veteran of countless frontier conflicts, a man who had seen the worst of human depravity, but even he was shaken by the story Sheriff Kane laid before him. The bones, the folklore, and the chilling testimony of a clan insider painted a picture of an evil so sustained, and so deeply ingrained it seemed to belong to a darker age of human history. The plan was set for dawn. They would use the cover of the pre-dawn mist to surround the hollow homestead, a force of nearly 20 men in total. The element of surprise was their only true advantage against a family that knew every rock, tree, and hiding place in that valley. Alara's role was critical. She was to unbar the main gate and the door to the main house just before the posse made its move, preventing the clan from turning their home into an impregnable fortress. The night before the raid was heavy with a sense of impending destiny. Sheriff Kane couldn't shake the image of the well from his mind. A century of victims, their stories untold, their bones mingled together in the silent, dark water. He felt like an avenging angel, but also like a man staring into an abyss. What kind of people would they find in that hollow? Were they simply monsters, or were they victims of a different kind, trapped by a belief system passed down through generations like a genetic disease? He thought of Alara, a young woman caught between two worlds, betraying her own blood for a chance at a life would barely imagine. Her courage was the single point of light in this overwhelmingly dark affair. As the men checked their weapons and prepared for the morning, a heavy silence fell over the town of Prosperity. It was the calm before a storm that had been brewing in the isolated depths of Whisper Creek Hollow for over 100 years. In the final hour before dawn, the posse moved into position. The air was cold and damp, the mist so thick it muffled all sound. Sheriff Kane and Marshal Thorne led a small group to the main gate, their hearts pounding in the oppressive silence. They could see a single candle burning in one of the windows of the main house, Alara's signal that she was awake and ready. The moments stretched into an eternity. Every rustle of leaves, every distant call of a night bird felt like a potential alarm. Then with a faint, almost imperceptible creak, the heavy wooden bar on the inside of the gate was lifted. A moment later, a shadow detached itself from the side of the main house and slipped back into the darkness. It was Alara. She had done her part. Kane and Thorne pushed the gate open and signaled to the rest of the men. They moved like wraiths across the compound, surrounding the main house and the smaller cabins. The Hollow's hounds, usually so vicious, were silent. Alara had fed them meat laced with a sleeping draft from Doc Abernathy. The plan was unfolding with near-perfect precision. Marshal Thorne took his position at the front door of the main house, his hand raised, ready to give the command to breach. Kane stood beside him, his shotgun feeling unnaturally heavy in his hands. This was it, the moment of confrontation, the end of a century of secret bloodshed. But just as Thorne was about to give the signal, a piercing scream shattered the pre-dawn stillness. It was a woman's scream, filled with rage and despair, and it came from inside the house. It was followed by the booming roar of a rifle. The element of surprise was gone. The hollow had woken up. The rifle shot from inside the main house was the signal for chaos. Lights flared in the windows of the other cabins as the men of the Hollow clan, roused from their sleep, grabbed their own weapons. The raid had devolved into a siege. Gunfire erupted from both sides, the sharp cracks echoing through the valley. The posse, though superior in numbers, was exposed in the open compound, while the Hollows were firing from the hardened cover of their log homes. In the initial volley, one of the marshals went down, a cry of pain swallowed by the cacophony of the firefight. Inside the main house, the scene was one of betrayal and horror. Elspeth Hollow, the matriarch, had awoken to find her daughter Alara unbarring the door. The old woman's intuition, honed by a lifetime of guarding her family's terrible secret, had understood the betrayal in an instant. Her scream was one of a high priestess watching her temple be desecrated. It was she who had fired the first shot, not at the lawman but at her own daughter. The shot had missed, splintering the doorframe next to Alara's head. Now, Silas and his sons were awake, their initial confusion turning to a cold, murderous fury as they realized what was happening. Alara was trapped, caught between the righteous anger of the law and the unholy wrath of her own family. Sheriff Kane and Marshal Thorne, seeing their plan disintegrating, made a critical decision. They had to breach the main house now, both to capture the clan's leadership and to save the life of their witness. With a group of marshals providing covering fire, they charged the porch, using a heavy log as a battering ram against the door Alara had failed to open. The heavy oak shuddered under the impact, the sounds of splintering wood mixing with the relentless gunfire. The battle for Whisper Creek Hollow had begun, a brutal, desperate fight at the edge of the civilized world. The door to the Hollow homestead splintered and burst inward, and the lawmen poured into the house. The interior was dark and smoky, smelling of gunpowder and burning tallow. The main room was a chaotic scene of overturned furniture and armed family members. Silas Hollow stood like a cornered bear, firing a large-caliber rifle from behind a heavy wooden table. His sons fought with a feral intensity, their faces contorted with rage. But it was the women who were the most terrifying. Elspeth, the matriarch, wielded an old horse pistol with fanaticism. Even the younger women, who looked barely out of their teens, were armed with knives and hatchets, ready to defend their home and their way of life to the death. Marshal Thorne was the first one through the door, and he was met by a blast from Silas's rifle that tore through his side, sending him staggering back. Sheriff Kane returned fire, his shotgun blast catching one of the sons in the chest and sending him sprawling. The fight descended into a brutal, close quarter. It was not a battle of tactics or strategy, it was a primal struggle for survival. Amid the chaos, Kane searched desperately for Alara. He found her huddled in a corner, shielded by an overturned cabinet, her face a mask of pure terror. She had become a non-person in this fight, an enemy to her own blood and a liability to the lawmen she had tried to help. Her mother, Elspeth, spotted Kane looking at her daughter and let out a chilling, high-pitched shriek. "The traitor will feed the well." She screamed, her voice cutting through the din of the battle. She raised her pistol, not at the sheriff, but once again at her own child. Before she could a deputy tackled her from the side, sending them both crashing to the floor. The scene was a living nightmare, a family tearing itself apart in a storm of lead and fury, all to protect a secret buried in the earth. The firefight at the main house raged for nearly 20 minutes, a lifetime of noise, smoke, and death. In the end, the superior firepower and numbers of the posse prevailed. Silas Hollow was the last to fall, brought down by a volley of shots after he refused to surrender, his final act a defiant curse upon the outsiders who had desecrated his home. His sons were either dead or severely wounded. The battle for the soul of Whisper Creek Hollow was over, and the cost was high. 2 marshals and 1 deputy lay dead in the compound, with several more. 4 of the men were dead, and the rest, including the women, were taken into custody. As the smoke cleared and the eerie silence of the hollow returned, Sheriff Kane finally reached Alara. She was physically unharmed but in a state of profound shock, trembling uncontrollably. She stared at the bodies of her father and brothers, her expression unreadable. Was it grief, relief, or simply the vacant stare of someone whose entire world had been annihilated in a matter of minutes? The surviving members of the clan were rounded up. They were utterly defeated, yet entirely unrepentant. As they were led away in chains, Elspeth Hollow fixed her burning gaze on her daughter. She didn't speak, but her eyes conveyed a curse more potent than any words. It was a look of pure, undiluted hatred, the look of a queen whose line has been ended by a traitor in her own court. The law had won, but it was a hollow victory. The dark spirit of the place seemed to linger in the air, a malevolent presence that could not be killed with bullets or bound in chains. The true evil of Whisper Creek Hollow was not just in the people, but in the belief that had sustained them, and that was something that could not be so easily eradicated. In the aftermath of the raid, a full-scale excavation of the Well of Bones began. Under the cold, gray sky of a Missouri spring, workers began the grim task of emptying the well. What they found surpassed even Sheriff Kane's most horrifying expectations. It was not a matter of dozens of victims, but hundreds. The well was nearly 30 feet deep, and almost the entire shaft was filled with a compressed, tangled mass of human remains. They brought out the bones of men, women, and children, a silent testament to over a century of ritualistic murder. The sheer scale of the killing was incomprehensible. It was a secret, small-scale genocide that had been operating in the heart of America for generations. Doc Abernathy worked tirelessly for weeks, attempting to catalog the remains. He identified bones that were fresh, from victims likely taken within the last few years, and others that were ancient, brittle, and brown with age, likely belonging to the very first offerings made by Jedediah Hollow. He found the remains of the Schneider family, identifiable by a small silver locket found tangled in the ribs of what was once a young girl. He found a skeleton with a clerical collar still clinging to its neck bones, Reverend Elijah Tate. He found the remains of the fur trappers and the land surveyor. For every cold case that was solved, there were a dozen more unknown victims, their identities lost to time, their only memorial this macabre, communal grave. The well became a national story, a source of morbid fascination and horror for people across the country. Reporters traveled to the remote Ozark Hollow, writing sensationalist articles about the cannibal cult and the devil family of Missouri. Whisper Creek Hollow, once a place of absolute secrecy, was now a spectacle. Its dark history had been violently exhumed and put on display for all the world to see. The trial of the surviving members of the Hollow clan was a sensation, but it was also a legal quagmire. The younger members, particularly the women, claimed they had no direct involvement in the killings, that they were merely following the orders and the faith of their elders. They professed a complete, brainwashed belief in the necessity of the tithe. How do you prosecute Piop? For a crime they genuinely believed was a sacred religious duty. The clan's absolute refusal to cooperate made it nearly impossible to tie specific individuals to specific murders, especially those that had occurred decades ago. The star witness, of course, was Elara Hollow. She testified for 3 days, her voice a low, steady monotone as she recounted the horrifying traditions of her family. She described the rituals, named the victims she could remember, and detailed the roles her mother, father, and brothers had played. On the stand, she was forced to look at her mother, Elspeth, who sat stone-faced and silent, her eyes never leaving her daughter's face. The trial became a spectacle of the macabre. The strange, marked bones were presented as evidence. Stories of the land's hunger were told in a court of law. To the lawyers and the judge from the city, it was like something out of a penny dreadful novel. In the end, the evidence was overwhelming enough to secure convictions for the most senior members. Elspeth Hollow and her 2 surviving sons were sentenced to hang for the murders they had committed in living memory. The other, younger members of the clan were given long prison sentences, their lives to be spent far from the hollow that had defined and damned them. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But many, including Sheriff Kane, felt that the true source of the evil, the twisted belief system itself, had escaped the noose. Elara Hollow was given a new name and put on a train heading east, under the protection of the U.S. Marshals Service. She vanished into the anonymity of the growing nation, her past erased, her future a blank page. No one ever heard from her again. She became a ghost, a footnote in the horrifying story she had helped bring to light. Did she find the peace and freedom she craved, or was she forever haunted by the faces of her family and the chilling memory of the Well of Echoes? We can never know. Her story ends there, a loose thread in a tapestry of horror. The hanging of Elspeth Hollow and her sons was a public event, drawing crowds from 3 states. Elspeth went to the gallows without a word of repentance. Her final act was to stare out at the crowd, her lips moving in a silent curse. To the very end, she remained the high priestess of her dark faith. After the executions, the hollow homestead was burned to the ground by order of the state. The well was filled with rocks, dirt, and lime, and then sealed with a thick cap of concrete. The authorities wanted to erase Whisper Creek Hollow from the map, to sanitize the land and wipe away the stain of the clan's century-long reign of terror. The story of the Hollow clan became a cautionary tale, a piece of forbidden history that frightened and fascinated in equal measure. But in the Ozarks, some of the old folk knew the truth. You cannot kill a belief with a rope or a fire. You cannot erase a curse by sealing a well. The land remembers, and it is patient. The dark legacy of the Hollow clan was far from over. If you want to understand the full, disturbing truth of what happened next, and how the curse of the Hollow clan endured, ensure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on. The final act of this story is a chilling reminder that some evils can never truly be buried. For several decades, Whisper Creek Hollow remained abandoned. The land, now state property, was deemed unfit for settlement. The story of the Well of Bones was too potent, the stigma too deep. Nature began to reclaim the clearing where the homestead had stood. Wild vines grew over the scorched foundations, and the forest slowly encroached on the fields the hollows had once tilled. The concrete cap over the well became covered with moss and dirt, eventually disappearing from view, becoming just another feature of the forest floor. The story itself began to fade from living memory into the realm of legend. It became a local ghost story, a tale to scare children. Don't wander too far or the hollows will get you. The specifics grew fuzzy, the names of the victims were forgotten, and the true, horrifying scale of the clan's practices was diminished with each retelling. The Well of Bones became a metaphor, a spooky campfire tale, rather than a historical fact. But in the early 1900s, strange reports began to surface once more. Hunters and loggers working on the edges of the hollow's territory spoke of an unsettling feeling in the woods, of being watched by unseen eyes. Some reported hearing faint chanting on the wind on moonless nights, the same kind of stories that had been told a generation earlier. Livestock began to disappear from farms bordering the old hollow property, found weeks later, not eaten by predators but strangely mutilated, with the same kind of precise, parallel cuts that Doc Abernathy had found on the human bones from the well. The old fears, long dormant, began to stir. Had something of the Hollow clan survived? Or had the land itself, long deprived of its tithe, begun to hunger once more? The mystery deepened in 1928, when a folklorist from a university in St. Louis, a man named Dr. Alastair Finch, became fascinated with the legend of the Hollow clan. He saw it as a unique case of preserved, albeit twisted, European folklore in the isolated American frontier. He traveled to Prosperity to interview the descendants of the people who had lived through the events of 1871. He found that while the official story was one of a crime solved and a family brought to justice, the local narrative was far more ambiguous. The grandchildren of Sheriff Kane's contemporaries spoke in hushed tones of a darker truth. They claimed that not all of the Hollow clan had been captured or killed in the raid. A few of the younger children, deemed too innocent to be complicit in the family's crimes, had been sent away to orphanages. Furthermore, there were rumors of distant cousins, branches of the Hollow family that had settled in other remote parts of the mountains decades before the raid, who had never been accounted for. The official record was neat and tidy, but the local memory was messy, filled with whispers of survivors. These survivors, the stories went, had never forgotten the old ways. They were waiting, biding their time, for the day when they could reclaim their ancestral land and rekindle their dark faith. Dr. Finch, a man of science and reason, was intrigued but skeptical. He decided to venture into Whisper Creek Hollow himself to see the place where the legend was born. He hired a local guide, a grizzled old man who reluctantly agreed to take him as far as the valley entrance but no further. "Some places are best left alone, mister," the guide warned. "That ground is sour." Finch, dismissing the warning as local superstition, pressed on alone, determined to find the sealed well and the ruins of the infamous homestead. Dr. Alastair Finch was never seen again. His disappearance created a brief stir, but authorities, remembering the area's dark history, were reluctant to mount a full-scale search into the forbidding wilderness of Whisper Creek Hollow. They concluded that he had likely fallen victim to the treacherous terrain or a wild animal. His case was officially closed as a death by misadventure. But his research notes, left behind in his hotel room in Prosperity, told a different story. In his final entries, Finch wrote of a growing sense of unease as he explored the hollow. He described the woods as oppressively silent and noted a series of strange symbols carved into the trees, symbols that matched the descriptions of the ritualistic mark of the Hollow clan he had read about in the trial records. He had found the ruins of the homestead, and more chillingly, he wrote that he believed he had located the sealed well. In his last frantic entry, penned the evening before he vanished, he wrote, "The concrete cap is not intact. It has been disturbed. Something has been digging at it from the outside. There are fresh tracks everywhere, and I am absolutely certain that I am being watched." Finch's disappearance added a new, modern chapter to the macabre legend. Had he stumbled upon a resurgent cult, the descendants of the Hollow clan, now practicing their ancestral traditions in secret? Had they taken him as a new tithe for the land, a fresh offering for the spirit that their forefathers had worshipped with blood and bone? Or was it something else entirely, a paranoid delusion in a man who had immersed himself too deeply in a horrifying story? The truth vanished with him, swallowed by the silence of Whisper Creek Hollow. His disappearance served as a stark, terrifying warning. The evil that had been born in that valley was not dead. It was merely sleeping. The story might have ended there, as a chilling piece of unresolved local history, a testament to a dark chapter best forgotten. But it did not. The final, and perhaps most disturbing, piece of the puzzle emerged in the late 1960s, during the construction of a new highway through that part of the Ozarks. A survey crew was tasked with blasting through a ridge on the very edge of what was once the Hollow clan's territory. As they drilled into the ancient rock, they broke through into a previously unknown cave system, a network of limestone caverns deep beneath the hills. Inside, they found something that would once again bring the name of the Hollow clan into the national spotlight. The cave was a natural ossuary. Piles of bones, human and animal, were stacked neatly along the walls, but this was not another dumping ground. It was a tomb, a place of reverence. In the main chamber, arranged in a semicircle, were the skeletons of what appeared to be the clan's patriarchs and matriarchs, their bones adorned with primitive jewelry made of stone and animal teeth. And in the very center of the chamber was a crude stone altar. On that altar lay a single, massive, leather-bound book, It-W. As the clan's sacred text, a handwritten chronicle of their history, their beliefs, and their rituals passed down from one generation to the next. The book was a testament of pure evil, a horrifying window into the minds of the Hollow clan. It detailed every sacrifice made to the land, every victim's name when known, and the blessings the land gave in return: a good harvest, the birth of a healthy child, the death of a rival. It was their Bible, their ledger, and their confession, all in one. The Hollow clan's Book of the Land, as it came to be called, was a document of unparalleled horror. Written in a spidery script that changed with each generation's scribe, it laid bare the full extent of their macabre theology. The book confirmed that their founder, Jedediah Hollow, had not simply chosen the valley for its isolation. He believed he had been led there by a vision, a promise from the spirit of the earth that he and his descendants would be granted dominion over the hollow if they fed it with the lifeblood of outsiders. The well was not their only sacred site. It was merely the mouth. The cave system was the heart, where the spirits of the clan's elders resided, watching over their descendants. The book contained detailed instructions for the rituals. It described how to select a victim, how to perform the ritual carvings, and which chants to recite to ensure the offering's energy was fully absorbed by the land. It was a step-by-step guide to ritual murder, refined over more than a century. The most chilling passages were the justifications. The Hollows did not see their actions as evil. They saw themselves as protectors, as stewards of an ancient pact. They believed the outside world was corrupt and soulless, and that by sacrificing outsiders, they were not only nourishing their land but also purifying it. They were engaged in a holy war, a secret generational struggle against a world they had rejected. The book also confirmed the local rumors. It spoke of other branches of the family, the Seed clans, who had been sent out decades before the raid to find other, similar hollows, other places where the spirit of the land was strong and hungry. The book suggested that the Hollow clan of Whisper Creek was not a unique aberration, but merely the founding chapter of a sprawling, secret faith. The discovery of the book and the cave ossuary led to a renewed, though secret, investigation by state authorities. They began to cross-reference the names in the book with unsolved disappearance cases from all over the region, and even from neighboring states. The results were terrifying. The Hollow clan's reach had been far greater than anyone had ever imagined. Their hunts had sometimes taken them hundreds of miles from their valley. The book gave chilling, brief accounts of their victims: a man of coin on the Natchez Trace, a family in a broken wagon, a lone soldier returning from the war. The book effectively solved dozens of cold cases, some over 150 years old. It was a secret history of violence that ran like a dark river beneath the official history of the American frontier. The existence of the Seed clans was the most alarming revelation. The book mentioned 3 other family lines that had departed from Whisper Creek between 1820 and 1850, heading for remote, unsettled regions in Arkansas, Tennessee, and the Appalachian Mountains of Kentucky. The book spoke of them in prophetic terms, as apostles carrying their dark gospel to new lands. The horrifying implication was that other wells of bones might exist, hidden in the forgotten corners of the country, still being tended to by the descendants of the Hollow clan, still demanding their tithe of blood. The investigation turned into a discreet, multi-state search for any evidence of these offshoot clans. But it was like searching for ghosts. The families would have changed their names, assimilated, and hidden their traditions under a veneer of rural normalcy. How could you identify a people whose entire existence was predicated on secrecy and isolation? The search yielded nothing. The Seed clans, if they existed, remained hidden. The Book of the Land was deemed too inflammatory, too dangerous for public knowledge. Its contents were sealed away in a state archive, classified and accessible only to a handful of historians and law enforcement officials. The official story of the cave discovery was muted. It was reported as an old, abandoned Indian burial site. The state had no desire to create a new wave of panic or to inspire morbid curiosity seekers. The name of the Hollow clan was once again buried, this time under a mountain of government secrecy. Whisper Creek Hollow itself was eventually flooded in the 1970s as part of a dam and reservoir project. The valley that had been the clan's fortress and temple for over 150 years now lies at the bottom of a deep, man-made lake. The ruins of the homestead, the sealed well, the entrance to the sea, Ave of elders, all are now submerged in a cold, dark silence. On the surface, the lake is a placid, beautiful place, popular with fishermen and boaters, but locals who know the history never go there. They say that on still nights you can sometimes see strange lights shimmering up from the depths, and that the fish caught in the deepest parts of the lake are unnaturally pale and taste of cold earth. They believe the water has not drowned the spirit of the land, but has merely given it a new form. They say it is still hungry. The act of submerging the valley was meant to be a final, definitive erasure of its tainted history, a baptism to wash away its sins. But instead, it feels like a different kind of burial, one that has preserved the evil rather than destroying it. The secrets of the Hollow clan are not gone. They are merely sleeping at the bottom of a lake, waiting. The story of the Hollow clan offers no easy answers, no comforting resolution. It is a chilling exploration of the darkness that can flourish in isolation and the terrifying power of a belief system, no matter how monstrous. Were the Hollows simply insane, a family afflicted by a shared generational psychosis? Or were they truly in communion with some malevolent entity, a genius loci that demanded blood in exchange for sustenance? The question lingers, unanswered. Perhaps the most disturbing legacy of the Hollow Clan is not the Well of Bones itself, but the idea of the seed clans. The thought that other similar communities might exist, hidden in the remote, rural pockets of the country, is a deeply unsettling one. Here to be simple, reclusive country folk, but who are, in reality, the custodians of a dark pact, tending to their own sacred wells and making their own periodic sacrifices. How many unsolved disappearances in rural America could be attributed to such a cause? How many people, written off as runaways or victims of accident, were actually tithes for a hungry piece of land? The Hollow Clan story suggests that the wilderness of the human soul can be far more dangerous than any untamed frontier. They were not monsters in the traditional sense. They were people, driven by a powerful and coherent, albeit horrifying, faith. They were a testament to the fact that the most profound evils are often those that are committed with absolute conviction, in the sincere belief that they are not evils at all, but sacred duties. Their history is a forbidden one, a cold case that reaches across centuries, a chilling reminder that not all of the ghosts of the old, weird America have been laid to rest. Let us return for a moment to 1871 to Sheriff Josiah Kane. The man who unearthed the horrifying truth of Whisper Creek Hollow did not find peace after the trial. He was hailed as a hero, but the victory was a poisoned one. He resigned as sheriff a year after the hangings. Man. He had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back into him. He was plagued by nightmares, not of the violence of the raid, but of the calm, unwavering certainty in the eyes of the Hollow Clan. He was haunted by Elspeth's final, silent curse, and by the words of Selah's. The land takes what it needs. He could not reconcile the civilized world of laws and courts with the ancient, primal world he had discovered in the Hollow. He spent the rest of his life as a recluse, poring over old books on folklore and religion, trying to find an explanation, a context for the evil he had faced. He never found one. He died in 1899, and his personal journals revealed a man tormented by the belief that he had not ended the threat, but had merely scattered it. He wrote of his fear of the seed clans, a fear that what he had fought in Whisper Creek was just one head of a hydra, and that the other heads were still out there, growing in the darkness. He feared that by destroying the heart of the clan, he had inadvertently forced its evil to metastasize, to spread and adapt in ways that would make it impossible to ever find again. His final entry, written the night before his death, is a chilling epitaph for the entire affair. I have brought the light of the law to the Hollow. I fear all I did was teach the objects recovered from the Hollow Clan, the ritual obsidian knife, a few of the strange, marked bones, and the horrifying Book of the Land, are now held in a secure, climate-controlled vault. They are not on display. They are considered artifacts of a unique and disturbing case of American historical pathology. Occasionally, a select few academics or law enforcement profilers are granted access. Those who have seen the book, who have read the cold, methodical entries detailing the murders, are said to come away changed. They speak of a palpable sense of malevolence that clings to the object, as if the ink and paper themselves are saturated with the suffering of its victims. One historian who studied the book described the experience as looking at the unredacted minutes of hell. The book is more than just a historical document. It is a living piece of the clan's evil. It is the repository of their faith, the physical embodiment of their pact. And as long as it exists, their story is not truly over. A dark question remains. What if the book is not just a record, but a source of power? What if the beliefs it contains still hold sway, waiting for a new reader, a new disciple, a new clan to find a new hollow and begin the tithe once more? The book sits in its climate-controlled dark, ancient evil, waiting patiently for the right conditions to grow again. The legacy of the Hollow Clan is not just a story of the past. It is a potential blueprint for future horrors. Today, the surface of Whisper Creek Lake shows no sign of the history that lies beneath its waves. Tourists and locals fish and swim in its clear waters, blissfully unaware that they are floating above a mass grave, above the ruins of a sacrificial altar, above the entrance to a subterranean tomb. The story of the Hollow clan and their well of bones has become a half-forgotten legend, a whisper in the deep woods of the Ozarks. But the questions remain. Did Alara Hollow ever escape the ghosts of her past, or did her mother's curse follow her to the end of her days? Are the descendants of the Seed clan still out there, living in quiet isolation, practicing the old ways taught to them by their ancestors? Is the spirit of the land in Whisper Creek Hollow truly dormant beneath the water, or is it merely waiting for the dam to break, for the water to recede, for its sacred sites to be exposed once more to the light of the moon? The case is officially closed, a dark chapter of American history written and filed away. But the story feels unfinished, the evil not vanquished but dispelled. The well was a physical place, a hole in the ground that could be filled with concrete. But the belief that consecrated it, the dark faith that fed it for over a century, that is a much deeper abyss, and it cannot be so easily sealed. The disturbing history of the Hollow clan's Well of Bones serves as a chilling reminder of the dark currents that run beneath the surface of history. It shows us that the line between civilization and savagery, between faith and fanaticism, is terrifyingly thin. In the isolated pockets of the world, away from the eyes of society, strange and terrible things can take root and flourish, creating their own moral universes, their own brutal logics. The Hollows were not an anomaly. They were the product of isolation, tradition, and a landscape that was as unforgiving as the God they chose to worship. Their story forces us to look at the blank spaces on the map, the remote valleys and forgotten backwoods, and wonder what other secrets they hold. It challenges our modern assumption that the darkness of the past has been fully illuminated, that the monsters have all been slain. The truth is, some monsters are not creatures of fantasy, but of flesh and blood, living by a code that is incomprehensible to the outside world. They are our neighbors, hidden in plain sight, buried just beneath the surface of the earth. The story of Whisper Creek Hollow did not end in 1871. It continues to echo through time, a cautionary tale whispered on the wind, a reminder that the land has a long memory and that some debts can only be paid in blood. In the end, we are left with the silence of the water, the deep, cold silence of Whisper Creek Lake, which guards its secrets with an unyielding patience. The evidence is gone, the perpetrators are gone, and the witnesses are gone. All that remains is the story, a chilling piece of forbidden folklore that feels disturbingly real. It is a story that seeps into your consciousness and leaves a permanent stain, a lingering sense of dread. The next time you find yourself on a lonely road, passing through a remote and quiet valley, you might look at the dark, silent woods and wonder. You might see a shuttered farmhouse set far back from the road and feel a prickle of unease. You might remember the story of the Hollow clan, of a family who believed the land itself was a hungry, living entity. And you might ask yourself a final, chilling question. How many other hollows are out there? And in how many of them is the well still open?